We should be recording now. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Welcome to our webinar organized by the European Health Psychology Society Open Science Special Interest Group. And today's webinar will focus on the topic of registered reports. And just to note that this webinar will be recorded, is being recorded right now, and will be uploaded to YouTube later on today. So just to kind of, for those of you who are joining us for the first time today, provide you with a brief overview in terms of what we get up to with the European Health Psychology Society's Open Science Special Interests Group. So broadly speaking, our aims are to bring together health psychology researchers interested in open science and to advocate for best practice in terms of open science in health psychology research. So we have a number of events that we organize throughout the year, such as this one. So if you're interested in keeping up to date with our activities, I would strongly recommend signing up to our mailing list, stay informed of our upcoming activities and any future webinars that we have planned over the next few months. So you can scan the QR code there on the screen now and sign up to our mailing list that goes out pretty regularly, a few times a year. To all of our members. And you don't have to be considering yourself a health psychology researcher to join SIG. We're open to a broad range of interests in terms of open science. So do sign up to the mailing list as well. Okay, so then having said that, I'd like to introduce to you today our speaker, Dr. Aoife O'Mahony from University College Cork. She is in the School of Public Health as a postdoctoral researcher, and she completed her PhD at Cardiff University, looking at registered reports and whether research published in this format is more rigorous and transparent than traditionally published scientific research. And so she is eminently qualified to speak on this topic today. So over to you, Aoife.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So I'll just share my slides. Can you see those okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. Really happy to have this chance to talk to you today about a topic that, as you can probably tell from Rory's introduction, is very close to my heart. So, I think the registered report format has a lot of promise and has proved very popular so far, but maybe not so much in areas related to health research. So I think it would be great to see this being used more widely, and I hope that this talk might maybe help with that a little bit. So I'm hoping to give a bit of an overview of what registered reports are, how these can be beneficial, and some examples of published stage 1 and stage 2 reports of different types, before also briefly just mentioning some more recent innovations and kind of just cool things that people have been doing with the format, like the peer community and registered reports platform, for example, which has really kind of taken registered reports to the next level. So just to give some brief background, in recent years, there's been growing concern about the rigor and the credibility of research within the social and life sciences, with this being referred to by many people as the replication crisis. And this is particularly an issue within psychology because a lot of previous study findings couldn't be replicated, making a lot of people question how reliable or trustworthy a lot of research really is. So there are thought to be a lot of different contributing factors to this, including a lack of methodological rigor and underpowered studies, a lot of biased and selective reporting, and publication bias, whereby null results are much less likely to be published than statistically significant findings. And this is an issue because in academia, as we know, we have this huge publish or perish culture that puts a lot of pressure on researchers to publish lots of papers in order to succeed and to advance our careers. And this expectation to publish so prolifically can lead to prioritizing quantity over quality. So this also means that the pressure is really on to make sure that our papers do get accepted by the journals, by the reviewers, and this can unfortunately incentivize some kind of concerning practices by some researchers in order to increase the likelihood of their work being published. In particular, p-hacking is a term that's often used in discussions about these kind of issues. As researchers, we often have choices about how we go about analyzing our data and different choices we can make during that process. And p-hacking occurs when researchers either consciously or unconsciously exploit that flexibility. And it tends to refer to manipulating data analysis until it produces statistically significant results, even if that may compromise the kind of truthfulness of the findings. P-hacking can also be known as data dredging or phishing or cherry picking, and it can kind of become like this image on the bottom of the slide of essentially kind of torturing the data until it gives you something significant that you can use, even if that's maybe not actually the most valid reflection of the results. Harking then is another piece of jargon that often comes up in this area. It stands for hypothesizing after results are known. And essentially, it's changing or adding hypotheses after you've analyzed the data to make it look like you predicted those findings from the start. So essentially, passing off more exploratory research as being confirmatory in order to kind of tell a better or sort of tidier story with the data and to potentially increase chances of publication. And these kinds of practices are really common. Estimates vary really widely, but some studies have suggested rates of up to 38%. Other studies have suggested possibly up to 88%. So those are very, very different numbers, of course, but they do definitely suggest that these kind of practices are really common. And, if we just take harking for a second as an example, various studies have reported rates of 27%, about 1/3, about 40%. So depending on how that's measured. But overall, these kind of practices do seem to be quite widespread as far as the evidence that we have suggests. Unfortunately, these kind of questionable research practices may have a role in the overrepresentation of positive findings that are published. So, for example, a couple of studies have found rates of around 95% of results in psychology being positive, so kind of hypothesis being supported. And 95% is a huge number. And while a lot of those may be completely valid positive findings, it is a disproportionately high proportion, which we can probably reasonably assume is a bit unrealistic. And so that kind of raises questions about the validity of those conclusions, particularly in light of recent efforts to replicate key findings in psychology and other areas, and a lot of studies not being able to do so. So some of these results may be false positives, which kind of don't bear up when attempts are made to replicate them. This then undermines the credibility of research more generally, especially if theory is then built up around these false positives. They can kind of continue to distort the literature in the longer term, and then they can become kind of difficult to eradicate. And as a kind of slightly separate but related point, a lot of studies with null findings can't get published because they can't really compete with these more exciting, significant results. And this just reinforces the problem further. And it means that what we see being published tends to be the positive findings, and we don't see the full range of research really being done on most topics. Instead, we're seeing this really kind of positively biased view that might not entirely reflect reality. Even when we are seeing valid studies and findings being reported that are positive, it's not being balanced out by other findings because those null results are so much less likely to be shared. So I think it's important to bear in mind in this conversation that although researchers are put in a really difficult position, because to steal some slides that Chris Chambers frequently uses in his talks, if you think about the different parts of the research process, from conceptualizing the questions and the study design, gathering the data, choosing how to analyze the data, and so on. It's really the results that are the part that all researchers really have the least control over, because ultimately, what you get is kind of what you get. And yet, if we think about the part of that process that has the most impact on career advancement for researchers, it's the novel and exciting findings. So this is really tricky, because to ensure that we're working with integrity, we need to ensure that we don't manipulate or misrepresent the results of our research, because that would be dishonest. But we also need to ensure that the results are amazing. Because if they're not exciting enough, they're unlikely to get published, so this won't help to advance our careers, and the null findings often won't be shared at all, so leading to what is known as the file drawer problem. So that massive overrepresentation of statistically significant findings or positive findings in the published literature, with very little representation of those null findings. And that's where the registered reports publishing model comes in. So in the registered report model, a stage 1 protocol consisting of the rationale, the hypotheses, if there are any, and the methods and analysis plan are submitted to the journal or publication platform for peer review before data is collected. So the article can receive in-principle acceptance then, which is an agreement from the journal to publish the subsequent finished article, regardless of whether the results are statistically significant, as long as the researchers adhere to their stage 1 protocol. So the importance of the research question and the quality of the methods really influence the publication decision rather than the findings. Once you have that decision confirmed, you would then, at stage 1, you would have your provisional acceptance. You would then go ahead and collect your data, analyze it, and write it up as a paper. So what's referred to for registered reports as the stage 2 report. There is also peer review at stage 2. So when you submit the final report of the study, when it's complete, but that second peer review is really more focused on checking that you've complied with what you said you'd do in your stage 1 protocol. Things like checking whether any quality checks that you said you'd do are met, and ensuring as well that your conclusions are a reasonable interpretation of the data. So as long as you've done what you said you'd do in your stage 1 protocol that was approved, then the provisional in-principle acceptance should be upheld by the journal, and the final article should get published as planned. So I think it's important to note there are a lot of similarities between pre-registration more generally and registered reports in particular, and people often aren't totally clear on the differences between them. So you might be familiar with pre-registering studies on Open Science Framework or somewhere else like that, or registering a systematic review protocol on Prospero or something like that. You might even publish a protocol in a journal, but registered reports are distinct in that the protocol submitted to the journal gets peer reviewed and can receive that in-principle acceptance of the final results manuscript. And that peer review and in-principle acceptance decision is made before the data is collected. So that's kind of the key sort of active ingredient that differentiates this approach from more general pre-registration or publishing a protocol in a journal without it being a registered report. So there are a number of benefits to this approach, or kind of proposed benefits to this approach, namely that authors can get a guaranteed publication agreed before they ever collect their data, which, as you can imagine, is a nice way to start your study. And while it can mean a bit more work upfront at the start of the process, it's all work that needs to be done at some point anyway, just rather than trying to convince reviewers of the value of your study when it's already been done and the methods can't be changed anymore. you do the work of submitting to the journal upfront and can go into data collection with that reassurance of a publication in place. The peer review feedback can also be used to improve the design before it's finalized, helping to ensure, helping to improve the quality of the study from the start, rather than, again, getting comments at the end about what the reviewers think you should have done differently when it's too late to incorporate that advice into the approach. And this is in addition to removing the incentives for authors to engage in selective reporting and other questionable research practices. Because by agreeing to accept the study, regardless of whether the findings are significant, authors no longer need to try to sell their results in a more desirable way. There's a bit more freedom to have null results, to have less novel, exciting stories to tell from your data. You can just focus on what is actually the most valid interpretation. And this commitment to accepting the study regardless of the findings also reduces the opportunity for the journal to engage in publication bias by only accepting studies if the results are exciting enough. With registered reports, that doesn't matter. And, it really helps to reduce these biased practices by reviewers and editors. So all of this hopefully helping towards the ultimate kind of overarching aim of increasing the rigor and transparency of published research more broadly, and allowing us to maybe have a little bit more trust in the studies conducted. It's not perfect, but it is helping to address a lot of the issues that are leading to this more biased body of literature. So registered reports have become increasingly common since they were first launched in 2013. And Cortex is usually credited as the first journal to launch registered reports, although they did kind of occur at a couple of other journals around the same time as well. And Chris Chambers had played a huge role in driving the adoption and implementation of this approach since introducing them at Cortex. Over the years, they've grown a lot more common. So they've been adopted at more and more journals in psychology and neuroscience, which are still the most common disciplines represented among registered reports. But they've also been spreading to other disciplines as well, including areas like finance and accounting research, cancer biology, politics and education, among others. So this infographic here on the right only goes up to 2020 because it's taken from a paper from a few years ago from Chris Chambers and Lucia Civella. But as you can see, the numbers have been increasing quite steadily, and the graph shows some of the important milestones for the format over the years, like some of the new areas it's begun to be adopted in, for example. And since the end point of that graph, the format has continued to grow and spread to new areas, as well as the development of the peer community in Registered Reports platform, which I'll mention briefly later in this talk. And finally, one of the more recent achievements is that Nature has begun to offer the format. So obviously having such a high profile journal adopt it is really encouraging. Nature Human Behavior has actually been offering registered reports for a few years already, since about 2017, I think, but having it be adopted by Nature more broadly was announced in 2023. So it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how that goes. As registered reports have been published in greater numbers, there's also been this opportunity for some research on these articles and how they compare to the standard article approach. So one of the main questions that's been asked is about supported hypotheses versus null findings, and how these compare between registered reports and standard reports. And while it is coming from observational studies, the evidence so far is consistently showing that registered reports have much higher rates of disconfirmed or unsupported hypotheses, which is one of the intended benefits of the format, that they should help to allow more publication of null findings, so non-statistically significant findings, and hopefully help to reduce that kind of overrepresentation of positive findings that may not always be entirely scientifically accurate. So those higher rates of unsupported hypotheses or lower rates of supported hypotheses have been found in registered reports across 2 previous studies, as well as my own PhD research. If we look briefly at the rates in Allen and Mailer's study here on the left, it's around 65% unsupported hypotheses in registered reports, compared to much more lower rates in the standard literature of between about 5 and 20%. So really stark difference there. Likewise, Anna Shields' study, this one in the middle, you can see that almost all of the hypotheses in the standard reports that they examined had supported hypotheses, while less than half of those in registered reports had their hypotheses supported. Likewise, some of the results from my PhD here on the right, this showed that the sample of registered reports I examined were about as likely to have supported hypotheses as they were to have unsupported ones, while standard reports again had a much higher proportion of support for their hypotheses. Not quite as high as the proportion found by Shield, but there were some differences in how we went about measuring that and how many hypotheses from each paper we included. So that may account for those differences. But nevertheless, it's all showing the same general pattern, which is, while we can't say anything causal about this, it does seem to suggest that registered reports may be working as intended in allowing for more null findings and hopefully reducing the pressure to have statistically significant findings. Looking at some other aspects of the format then, registered reports have been found to have higher computational reproducibility than standard reports. So in terms of their data availability and its usability, that has been found to be better in registered reports. They are also rated higher for quality across a range of different criteria, which you can see in this figure on the right from Soderberg's paper a couple of years ago. In this study, they used a peer review type of process to get reviewers to evaluate registered reports and standard reports. So just to pick some of the criteria that they looked at, the registered reports were judged to be better on various indicators of kind of methodological rigor and quality, rigor of the analysis, whether the conclusions were justified, as well as some areas that people have been concerned about being affected negatively by registered reports being about the same or kind of, quite similar between the two approaches. So things like, innovation and novelty of the research question, creativity of the methods and things like that. People have been concerned that registered reports might negatively affect that, and the findings are suggesting that's not the case. So registered reports also seem to be cited at about the same amount as standard reports are, according to both a previous study by Hummer and also my own PhD research as well. While the evidence so far doesn't suggest a kind of a citation advantage to registered reports, they don't come at a citation cost as far as we can see. And that's probably quite encouraging as well, given that they do have a higher proportion of null findings. So some people have argued maybe they would be of less interest, but that doesn't seem to be the case according to the citation counts that we have. Another aspect I found to be better in registered reports was the use of sampling plans, which is understandable given that these are generally expected in stage 1 reports. So whether that's statistical sampling plans or kind of a more general, any sort of plan that might include kind of, particular approaches you might use in trying to access difficult to reach populations or whatever it might be. Whichever way the sampling plans were kind of defined, they were much, much higher in registered reports than standard reports. So overall, kind of encouraging evidence that registered reports do seem to be working as intended. And of course, it's observational data for the most part, but definitely pointing in the right direction. So overall, the evidence seems quite encouraging, but it has to be said there has been criticism of registered reports that have been published in relation to randomized control trials, with a study last year showing that about half of these have evidence of outcome switching. And that's often also that it's often unclear if the protocol really does predate the start of the study. So it indicates that there might be issues within these particular subset of registered reports, issues with compliance with the basic requirements of the format. It is worth noting, though, that all but one of the RCTs that were examined in the sample came from the same journal group. So it might not be so much that this is a widespread problem across a lot of different outlets as much as there hasn't been a lot of use of the registered report format for randomized control trials in any other journals, and maybe this one journal group just need to improve how they're handling this. As we hopefully start to see more adoption of the format in health research and RCTs in general, we may be able to get a better idea of whether this is a more widespread problem or just limited to this journal group. I, for one, would love to see more registered reports being used for RCTs and just for health research in general. So with registered reports having started out in psychology and neuroscience, and being more targeted towards confirmatory hypothesis testing approaches, they've mainly been used for kind of more experimental study designs using confirmatory hypothesis testing approaches. And because that's the type of study that's mostly been represented among registered reports so far, there's been a lot of debate about how appropriate the format is for other disciplines or other kinds of research designs and methodologies. One of the main debates that I've come across the most is whether it's suitable for qualitative research. And you can see some of the sources here that have kind of responded to this debate, suggesting that it is possible to do qualitative registered reports. The Leadership Quarterly article there on the top left actually provides some guidance on using registered reports for 4 different kinds of approaches, of which qualitative approaches are just one. So they've also mentioned meta-analyses and computational approaches, and one other that I can't remember at the moment, but I think it's a really good resource and a really nice article to check out, especially if you might be considering doing a registered report that maybe isn't the typical kind of design that's most often associated with registered reports. And yeah, so also some other resources there about the use of registered reports for qualitative research. And I suppose with all of that in mind, I just wanted to quickly point out some examples of some registered reports that take some different kinds of approaches. I won't go into them in detail, but I think it's always helpful to remind ourselves that the format has been and is being used in other types of studies, because very often when people think of registered reports, they think of kind of one thing, when actually they've been proven much more kind of versatile, and we're getting more and more examples through all the time now of the approach being used for different kinds of studies. So starting off with some qualitative studies across some different areas, the examples on this slide are all stage 1 registered report protocols, so no results through yet. Some of these are preprints of stage 1s, but they're really useful to look at as an example if, these are the kind of approaches that you might be interested in using for your registered reports. And in thinking about how you might kind of take a similar approach, the kinds of details that people have included. On this slide, then, you've got a couple of completed qualitative registered reports. So the stage 2s, not corresponding with the stage 1s that were on the previous slide, but just other examples. This one in nursing on the top left, I think, is outside of the papers published by the journal JMIR. I think this one in nursing was the first kind of qualitative registered report I came across. So a few years back, and then a couple of other examples there have been completed and have come through since then, covering topics in psychology, health, and a more kind of meta-science or more methodological approach. I think there are some other examples out there, but this is just to kind of give an overview of the kinds of areas that this has been used in. And it's really exciting because I know that was an ongoing kind of debate, and I was always really eager to see qualitative examples coming through, because I know there's a lot of questions about how these, whether these are suitable for the format and how the format can be adapted or needs to be more flexible to account for this. So, clear evidence there that it is possible. And I think those are a really useful kind of resource. I'm a big fan of examples in general, especially in relation to registered reports, because it's always comforting to see what other people have done and how they've kind of approached things. Moving on then to evidence synthesis. Registered reports have been used for some meta-analyses for a few years now. At the bottom right, you can see a link to Gilad Feldman's website. He and his team have completed a lot of registered reports, including some meta-analysis ones, and they've shared some templates from their own work that people might possibly find helpful, and their publications of registered reports that have used this approach in general are helpful to look at. So, given the typically very quantitative approaches that registered reports have typically been used for, it's probably no surprise that we're seeing examples of meta-analysis registered reports or systematic reviews with meta-analysis being kind of the main form of evidence synthesis that's been used with this format. The exception to this here is Emma Henderson's systematic map on the bottom left of the slide. So just mapping the literature on this topic, it doesn't involve meta-analysis, and it's a nice example of a completed review that kind of, is evidence synthesis, but it's not this highly quantitative approach. Because I think there were a real lack of examples of that in previous years, but that has been changing. If we look at this slide, the format has been used for other kinds of evidence synthesis approaches more recently. So these are all stage 1 protocols that have shown up quite recently. So if we take, for example, these umbrella reviews here at the top of the slide and the scoping review protocol underneath that, there's also a qualitative metasynthesis example here as well. And again, these are just stage 1 protocols, so just the accepted protocols at this stage, but still very helpful examples in their own right if anyone is looking to prepare a stage 1 for some kind of evidence synthesis approach that isn't your standard very quantitative meta-analysis approach. So I'll be really looking forward to seeing how these turn out in their final stage 2 reports. And then a common question is around the use of registered reports for secondary data analysis projects. So if using data from a database or some other existing data from some particular setting, whatever it might be, since those data already exist, even if the authors of the new study haven't seen it yet, people often have questions about whether registered reports can be used for this and kind of the specific challenges that they might encounter regarding this. In general, this use of registered reports for secondary data analysis does seem to be fine. It is generally accepted. Some journals might possibly have their own thoughts on this, but for the most part, as you can see, I've gone a bit overboard with the examples on this slide, but it definitely is something that's being used quite widely. And the examples at the bottom right of this slide are actually editorials for some previous special issues at a couple of journals that involved registered reports using secondary data analysis. So again, just showing that this approach really, there is a kind of a good representation of this. So examples are all well and good, but for some more general resources, Emma Henderson and Chris Chambers' paper from a couple of years ago, 10 Simple Rules for Writing a Registered Report, that's a really good resource. Emma Henderson did her whole PhD through registered reports. I think she published 3 of them in the end from her PhD. Could be more, but I think it was 3. And of course, Chris was behind the launch of the format at Cortex and the launch of them at so many other journals since then. So between the two of them, you really kind of couldn't ask for a better source. And that paper is really helpful. It contains some really good kind of general guidance, including an appendix of questions that you should ensure that your stage 1 protocol is able to answer. Of course, it is more kind of general, so sometimes applying this to particular approaches can be a bit more tricky, but it's a really, really good starting point that I think everyone should be aware of. They also have a nice flow chart about ethical approval, because that's another thing people often aren't very sure about, whether they need to have ethical approval in place before submitting the stage 1 protocol. My understanding was that this typically was needed, but this flowchart, which I'll skip over to briefly, and is in their paper, I do recommend checking that out if that's something you have questions about. So it kind of suggests that it can depend on the journal, and it gives you a little bit of a step-by-step for just what to check for or to consider in relation to the timing of your ethical approval for your registered report submission. So worth being aware of, even if in many cases you may still need to check with the editors of that particular journal. I know for PCI registered reports, which I'll talk a little bit about more later, they pretty much always want ethical approval in place already, but they are willing to kind of take exceptions to that on a case-by-case basis. It just can be a bit of an issue with getting the stage 1s accepted by the journals rather than the PCI platform, but I'm happy to circle back to that if people have questions about that after. So just switching back to that previous slide. Yeah, there's another really nice paper, I think, on kind of experiences or lessons learned about doing registered reports when I really like that kind of practical considerations paper there as well from an author perspective. And there's also the Centre for Open Science website. So the registered reports section of their site has links to various useful resources. In particular, I really like the tab on their website about participating journals. I think that's really useful to check what journals actually offer the format, so you can kind of see what the options there are. And if you're thinking about doing a registered report at a specific journal, it can be worth having a look at the community feedback site that Ben McGreblian at Cardiff University has created. This is where authors can leave reviews of their experiences publishing registered reports at different journals, so that you'd know if a particular journal maybe is not the best for speed or for like handling of the format, or alternatively, if the experience with them has been really, really good. So before I move on to a quick overview of some of the more recent changes in how registered reports are being offered, I just want to quickly highlight a special issue in the Journal of Health Psychology and Behavioral Medicine that has a call for papers. So for registered reports and also for data notes. And Emma Norris and Elaine Toomey from RSIG are involved in that, and it would be great to see more submissions coming through to that. So please do check that out if you or anyone you know might be interested in submitting to it, either for a registered report or for a data note. And underneath that, you can see our group published a paper in Health Psychology and Behavioral Medicine, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. And it's kind of trying to explain what these two types of articles are. And so that's worth checking out if you think you might like to submit one of those article types to that collection. With that in mind, I'm back to my examples and article screenshots. I tried to keep it to just a few brief examples, but there are a couple of slides on this that I'll just whiz through really quickly. And because this is being recorded, it's always possible to go back on our YouTube channel and have a look at those. So just a few examples of registered reports on topics that I thought are or could be considered within the scope of health psychology or behavioral medicine, kind of broadly defined. Because the format is new at the journal the special issue is being done with, of course, we don't really have examples from there, but I've had a look at examples across other journals and managed to find, I think, more than I kind of expected to serve as useful examples. These are primarily stage 2 reports, but there are some stage 1s on these slides as well. So, on this one, you've got some papers around like messaging, around personality traits and health, one around some aspect of exercise. Here we have some more examples. These are more kind of in relation to like various different topics, risk communication, substance abuse labels, and how that relates to stigma, one about disordered eating, excuse me. And what else? Things about eating disorders, drinking behavior, treatment response. And finally, I think these are all examples of stage 1 registered reports as well. So on various different topics, and I think stage 1s can be particularly helpful in just kind of seeing what the standard and kind of types of details needed are. Generally, it's advisable that your stage 1 protocol should change as little as possible between stage 1 and being the kind of introduction and method section of your stage 2 report. So there's probably not much difference between a stage 1 and the first kind of half of a research paper, or like a stage 2 registered report. So those can still be helpful examples in their own right, but I think stage 1s probably are a particularly helpful example. So here we've got some examples of opioid misuse and CBT mobile apps for anorexia, and physical activity for early childhood education. So, registered reports are being done for a broader and broader range of topics, and health psychology is being represented within that, even if some of these examples are drawn from a broad range of different journals rather than necessarily from health psychology journals. So, and of course, as always with examples, these are hopefully a useful resource. There may be some minor differences between journals in exactly how certain things are done or formatted, but the overall kind of standard and details and so on should be pretty similar. While I'm on the topic of registered reports in health psychology, these very quickly are journals I've come across that offer registered reports and that are probably most likely to be relevant to those of us doing research in health psychology, behavioral medicine, and those kinds of areas. This list is literally from just going into the Centre for Open Sciences participating journals list that I mentioned earlier and doing Control F for like health and other kind of related terms. So there may be others in that list as well that are of interest. But these were the ones that kind of jumped out as being journals that are particularly relevant. Some of the examples from those previous slides have been from these journals. Some of the examples were from other more general psychology journals or interdisciplinary ones, but those are also an option as well. And of course, we'd love if you'd submit to the special issue at Health Psychology and Behavioral Medicine, but if you want to consider other journals in the future, that list might be helpful. Okay, so the major innovation in the registered report approach in recent years has been the launch of peer community in registered reports, which is helping to address a lot of the previous concerns or limitations of the sort of journal-based registered report tracks. I kind of wanted to get the more individual journal-specific content covered first before I moved on to this newer platform, as well as the kind of more generic information, which a lot of that was. So I wanted to just get that covered before I talked about PCI to avoid too much confusion. And essentially, peer community in registered reports is a free, non-commercial platform for reviewing and recommending research report preprints across various different disciplines. And it's kind of like, rather than the journal editors having to do the work of handling registered reports, it can kind of get outsourced to this platform. And the submissions are then recommended by the platform to the journals. So your paper would be published as a preprint on the PCI platform anyway, but you, if accepted and ultimately going on to stage 2, you could choose from a list of journals that have signed up to the platform. And in particular, the list of PCI or friendly journals have committed to accepting papers recommended by this platform without any further peer review. So really, really nice platform to be aware of. Some other journals do sign up as only as PCI or interested rather than friendly. So that basically means they don't automatically accept the recommendations, but they have signed up to be alerted when a new stage 1 acceptance or stage 2 acceptance is recommended by PCI or. So the journal can then contact the authors to maybe arrange some additional peer review or just make a direct publication offer. So those are kind of a very limited number of journals, the interested version, but they're kind of benefiting from the system without fully signing up to it in the way that the friendly journals have. But it does increase the number of journals that might be interested in your submission. So good to be aware of. And while the PCI or platform is only around in the last couple of years, the last figure I heard for it was that there had been about 400 submissions before so far. So that's definitely very active, and that's probably an outdated number as well at this stage. So I won't go into this in much detail, but this approach compares to registered reports, in a number of ways. But as you can see, there are a lot more ticks in that last column. So there are a number of advantages because multiple journals sign up to PCI registered reports. Authors whose submission has been recommended can choose which of those eligible journals they're recommended to that they want to publish in, so giving them more options rather than submitting to a journal, maybe getting rejected and then having to try again. You're recommended to multiple at once, so it's more efficient and gives authors a little bit more control and kind of power. The recommenders, who are the equivalent of editors for the platform, have received specific training in handling registered reports. That's often not the case at journals that offer the format themselves. So you've got the added benefit of this proven expertise in relation to this format. And actually, I noticed earlier today there is a post on their website about looking for new recommenders for the PCI or platform. So that might be worth looking into if you think that's something you might be interested in being involved in. Essentially like being an editor, but slightly different. And there were some particular areas they were interested in having expertise in particular, one of which I know was qualitative research, as well as various other ones that they mentioned. So if you go on the PCI registered report website, you should be able to find that information if that's something you're interested in, or if you think someone else might be interested in becoming a recommender for their platform. Some other advantages of PCI registered reports are it allows for the submission of programmatic registered reports. So one stage 1 manuscript leading to multiple stage 2 outputs. So if you propose a program of research across multiple studies in your stage 1 protocol, you can get in principle acceptance for the results of all of those studies if you just stick to your approach that you stated in your protocol, of course. This is something that doesn't tend to be the case when individual journals are offering the format, or at least that hasn't been common in journals so far. And another major benefit of PCI registered reports is the scheduled review track. So one of the major concerns about registered reports has always been the time that stage 1 review can take, potentially delaying starting the study and making it more challenging for those on short-term contracts, student projects, and so on. And while careful planning can still allow that to be possible, it is a concern that PCI registered reports as a platform is really, really good at addressing. So with PCI or if you submit to this platform, you have the option to submit to their scheduled review track. So that peer review is you would submit a 1-page stage 1 snapshot of just the key details of your study. And then peer review is arranged and scheduled in advance while you finish your full stage 1 protocol. And that way, when you do submit your full stage 1 protocol, the reviewers should be confirmed and ready to go, reducing the review time really considerably. If you compare the red arrows in those two diagrams, you can see the peer review time is like drastically reduced in the scheduled review track. So that's a really nice option to be aware of, and definitely helps to address one of the major kind of challenges of this approach, or I suppose major concerns of this approach. So I will skip over this, but the one-page snapshot that you would be expected to submit to their scheduled review track is across these 2 slides. Literally, one-page research questions, maybe hypotheses if you have them, design, methods, analyses, conclusions that you might draw given different results. It's a very brief overview, and you would just submit that and have the peer review being arranged while you're writing up and fleshing that out into your stage 1 protocol. You can, of course, submit to PCI registered reports with their normal track as well, but this is a nice option to be aware of, especially if you are a bit pushed for time. One final thing that I wanted to mention, just because I think it's really cool, is registered reports funding partnerships. There have only been a few of these, but I would love to see more of them happening in the future. So this is essentially when the journal or possibly platform like PCI partners with a funder so that you would submit your proposal to be considered both for funding and for in-principle acceptance at the journal at the same time. So both the journal peer review process and the funding review process occur at the same time, or kind of, around the same time. And if successful, you would have both your funding and the guarantee of a publication. So really, really nice way of doing this. There have only been a few examples of this. Cancer Research UK did 2 of these partnerships a few years ago, where they partnered with Nicotine and Tobacco Research, the journal, for one of them. And I think for their other partnership, I think they had multiple possible journals. I believe PCI registered reports may have also had a funding partnership recently. They did something about consciousness research, and I think that was a funder partnership. So I think there's 1 or 2 other examples in the past as well. So there have been a few examples of these over the years, even though they're definitely not common. Early qualitative research from the team at Bristol University about these kinds of funding partnerships has suggested they seem to be quite feasible to set up. So in terms of kind of future directions that I would love to see more of in relation to registered reports, these kind of partnerships would be one of my main hopes for the future, for these becoming more common. There's even been the, I think, hypothetical suggestion that ethical approval could also be incorporated into this kind of combined review approach as well. So I'm not sure if that's ever been implemented in practice yet, but it's an interesting idea. And I think the journal and funder partnerships seem to have been proved fairly successful. So maybe it's not outside the realms of possibility in the future to also integrate ethical review into that as well. Just to close, I just want to emphasize that so much of the success of the registered report format so far has been because of individuals advocating for this, raising awareness of this, trying out the format for different kinds of research, even for methods that registered reports hadn't been previously used for. And that's still the case going forward. Even if whatever method you want to use hasn't really been represented in a registered report before, that might not necessarily mean that it's not suitable. It might just be, that you need to consider how it might be possible to do it, and whether particular journals may be open to, taking a flexible approach to this. Likewise, if you think there's a journal that should be offering registered reports or that should sign up to PCI registered reports, reaching out to them about it, or asking the people at PCI registered reports, suggesting they get in contact with a particular journal, that all helps to increase the reach of this format and helps to bring it into new areas. Likewise, if you're involved in a journal's editorial board, or if you're involved with funding agencies, anything that you can do to push for the format could be really important in making registered reports even more widely available, or increasing opportunities for future, registered report funding partnerships, all of those kinds of things, all of which hopefully gets us closer to just more trustworthy and credible research becoming more widespread and more kind of the norm. I think I've gone way over time, so sorry, but thank you so much for listening, and I'm really happy to take any questions that people might have.
Thank you very much, Aoife. That was very interesting and very clear and on time. So thank you very much. Um, we have a few minutes now for questions before we wrap up. So I see Emma has put into the chat. So Emma says, I love the registered community feedback tool you mentioned. And she hadn't heard of that before, neither had I. And she notes that timeliness of stage one reviews is so important. So this is a great tool. And her question is, do you know how this is being promoted thus far?
That's a really good question. I'm not 100% sure. I remember seeing posts about it on social media that I'm sure Ben made at the time. I think I've, probably seen it on Twitter back when that was a thing, when that was alive. Um, I've probably seen it on LinkedIn and things as well. It probably could be that, there could be more awareness of it. Um, so I think, word of mouth and promoting it any way that we can would be really beneficial. But yeah, I'd probably have to ask him if he's done anything else with it, because I think I've been very aware of it because, we've had the same PhD supervisor. I know Ben, so I've been aware of it. But yeah, maybe it hasn't kind of had as much of a reach as it could have, and I think it's a fantastic resource that I think really should be used much more. So yeah, yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest, but I think definitely there could be more work done.
Great. Does anyone else have any other questions for Aoife?
Yes. Hi, I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm working now on a piece of research which was initially submitted to the peer community in register report. So it's a stage one. Now we're doing the data analysis as specified in the protocol and hopefully submitted as stage two to be published. Now my question is, although you have, and I've read this in the past and you've done the presentation today, it's not clear to me how we actually choose a journal and how we publish the actual paper, stage two. So does it have to be a journal that is actually friendly to registered reports, as perhaps one of the journals which is on the PCI platform, or can it be completely different journal? I mean, how does that one go about finding the right journal for that?
Yeah, so within the PCI registered report platform, essentially when it's reviewed at stage two, and yeah, it would be kind of recommended to specific journals that are signed up to be PCI registered report friendly. And from what I understand, I think they check like if it's within scope for those journals, and so that you don't have to worry about that. So what I've seen is them being, the recommendations would be like recommended to, and there might be like 3 journals listed from within PCI registered reports, the friendly journals, and you could choose within those. So it would have to be within the journals that are signed up to them. If you did want to submit to a different journal outside of that, I think typically that would mean withdrawing it as a registered report and submitting it as a traditional article, which sometimes people do. But of course, after the work you've been through, you might not want to take that approach. So yeah, usually the recommenders will kind of help not make that decision as such, but kind of make sure that they're recommending it to any of the journals that it is suitable within their scope, if that makes sense.
Yes, because I'm actually thinking there's perhaps an issue here in terms of, as researchers, of course, we want the journals with the highest impact factor to publish, but I wonder whether those journals that we ideally want, would accept registered reports or a piece of work that has been previously submitted as a registered report and so on and so forth. So I think perhaps maybe that's a barrier for researchers to do more research like this, which I think is amazing because you get feedback before you do the data collection analysis, where you can actually still change things in light of peer review. And I wonder how we actually combine this with impact factors and all the expectations that we have in terms of publishing and
Yeah, I think a lot of it does come down to kind of advocacy for the format and trying to get more journals on board. Because I know, I remember Chris mentioning a few years back that like having Nature Human Behavior on board when they started offering it was really nice, because people might not make the effort for other journals, but they would be willing to do a registered report and submit it to Nature Human Behavior. And even if it didn't get accepted there, they've then got a stage 1 protocol they could submit to another journal. So I think you're right that, as much as we kind of maybe don't always want to support the whole impact factor thing and, the ways that that's problematic. I do think the high impact journals have a role to play in that. And, I'm definitely interested in trying to get more journals on board, particularly in health research, but more generally as well. And I think, the high profile ones are the ones to go after if at all possible, for that. But I know it's, it is challenging. I think I would hope that PCI registered reports maybe makes it a little bit easier to convince journals to get on board with it, when they don't have to do a lot of the work themselves. But I think it is a slow process. Unfortunately.
Thank you.
I see Adam's hand is raised, so over to you, Adam.
My camera's not working, sorry. I don't know what's going on
No
there.
worries.
Hopefully you can hear me. Thank you very much for the talk. Really interested in them. I work with Emma Brunow, part of the kind of open science team there. So just trying to push this across different disciplines. My main, not gripe, my main concern with the register report format is that it's not maybe very well catered to doctoral researchers, given their timelines for publishing a series of studies that kind of often have to wait for one study to near enough finish before you can move on to the next. I wondered if there's any kind of data on like the actual time, the speed for this process and how that could be built, or some kind of guidelines on building it into a PhD that could be shared, because I've attempted it with several and we've kind of got to that point where just getting ethical approval at the institution is long enough, and then you're having to wait further down the line to start the actual study once this goes through. So yeah, just welcome any information or guidance or kind of reflections on that, really.
Yeah, it is a challenge, and I think I'm not aware of kind of data on this. I mean, I'm sure there's internal data at the journals that could be analyzed, and in some ways I'd love to get my hands on that. But yeah, I think it just varies so much per journal that it's it's difficult to make a general statement about it, because in a lot of cases I can completely understand it is not feasible within these doctoral programs. I think the main thing is PCI registered reports scheduled review track is probably the main attempt at a solution to this. Of course, because there are only certain journals signed up to this, it's not maybe perfect. It might not have the journals that you're kind of interested in, but I think it's a good kind of first step in addressing that kind of major challenge. And the programmatic registered reports approach that they offer, potentially might be helpful as well for, where they do build on a previous study.
Yeah, that's a nice idea, actually. Yeah, so you scaffold kind of all three potentially experiments into one registered report in the hope that you can build from one to the next. That's an idea I hadn't come across. So yeah, that's cool.
And I think as more different types of designs have been used in registered reports, it's probably, I get a sense that editors and reviewers are maybe a bit more willing to consider different kinds of approaches and different kind of, there may be certain things you can't predict ahead of time for a programmatic approach, but I think maybe people are more interested and kind of open to considering, submissions, considering the different kinds of challenges that might be infringing on that. But I think it would be really nice if that kind of scheduled review track that PCI registered reports has, if that could be implemented in particular journals as well, like their internal tracks, would be so nice. Although it's probably a major challenge for them. It would be a bit of a wish list item maybe, but I think it could be hugely beneficial if it was. So yeah, sorry, not very practical advice.
No,
maybe,
that's great. No, that's useful actually, and just something I've been trying to work out myself. So just getting someone else's opinion on that kind of thing is valuable. Final thing, would you be open to sharing your slides at all? Just because we are trying to kind of communicate some of this out across the college, and it's just something that some of the qualitative that you shared there, I kind of was scribbling down to try and kind of, because I think that's the discipline in psychology that maybe it hasn't quite bought into this this approach yet, but I think it's happening. It's just helping it happen at the ground level.
Yeah, absolutely.
Super.
Yeah, I'm very happy to share my slides. Rory, is that something we can send around to everyone registered after?
Yes, I can send around the slides to everyone who registered for the webinar today, and the recording from today will go up onto our YouTube channel, and I'll send the link in that same email later on today. So we might leave it there for today unless there are any more questions. So that leaves me to say thank you very much, Aoife, for contributing today. I learned a lot myself, and it was all very interesting and very clear. And thank you to all of you as well for attending as well today. And as I said, if you missed anything from the last hour, the slides and recording will be posted and made available to you later on to review as well. So thank you very much for your time and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for organising. Thank you.